Broadly speaking, there are two major traditions in psychology: behaviorism and cognitivism. Now, that's a gross oversimplification, but hey, this isn't a psychology class, so I can get away with it. Behaviorism talks about looking at behaviors, looking externally at what people do. Cognitivism talks about mental states, what's internally going on in people's heads. Both of them are very relevant for gamification, and the relationship is not always well understood, which is why we're going to focus on them in detail. So first, let's talk about behaviorism. The program of behaviorism is as follows. We see this person here, and we know that there's something going on in their brain here. And we know that there are emotions and feelings and thoughts that people have. There's consciousness, because everyone says and knows that they are conscious. But if we're going to look systematically at why people do things and how to motivate people to do things, we can't focus on any of those internal mental states. Why? Because they are not scientifically testable. How do you feel? Well, you might know very well, but if you're explaining it to me, I'm only hearing your description of how you feel. I can't directly see how you feel. I can take a picture, image of what's in your brain, but that's just the electrical signals going back and forth. I don't see the actual feelings. So the Behaviorist Program was, let's restrict ourselves to what's out here. It's called the black box. I know this is a red box, but I don't have a black pen, so bear with me. The idea is what's in here, what's inside the person's head is off limits. It just does what it does. Our brains work, we know they work, that's fine. What we can test scientifically, scientific method, we have a hypothesis, we get data, we test the hypothesis, we falsify it, and through that process we advance knowledge. The idea is what we can test is basically what goes in, what's coming in from the outside, and what comes out. What does the person do? So that was the task that behaviorism set for itself. And in many ways, it was extremely successful. Many very powerful results came out of this black box approach. And in many ways, as we'll see, behaviorism is still relevant today. But it has real limitations. And those limitations become very apparent when we start to focus on gamification, as we'll get to later on. But first, let's talk about just what behaviorism says, because it is still instructive for some aspects of gamification design. The basic notion of behaviorism involves two things. The first is called a stimulus. So something gets done from the outside. I stamp on your foot. That's a stimulus. I offer you some money. That's a stimulus. Something happens that is externally creating some challenge or opportunity or reaction in the subject. And that reaction is called the response. So we see externally, we observe certain behavior, that's why it's called behaviorism, in response to the stimulus. And the first way that this was tested was in what's called classical conditioning, notably by Pavlov. You may have heard about Pavlov, his famous experiment where he could ring a bell and get dogs to salivate. The idea in Pavlovian conditioning, or classical conditioning, is the stimulus is instinctively related to the response. The animal, or presumably the person, just learns to associate ringing the bell with food coming. And so when the bell rings, that just automatically produces this response of salivating, whether or not there's actual food. That was classical conditioning. The more important kind of conditioning came later and is most notably associated with B.F. Skinner, and that's what's called operant conditioning. And the difference in the operant conditioning from the classical conditioning is we're not now talking about just an instinctive association of two things. We're talking about a feedback loop. So in operant conditioning, there is a stimulus and then a response, and based on that pattern, there is learning. So the response is ultimately conditioned upon the stimulus. The subject, whether it's an animal or a person, learns. They see the consequences of their actions. It's not just based on this happened and then that happened. There is a sense, a knowledge or an awareness that this stimulus produces this response, and when I respond in this way, then I get more of this stimulus. That's learning. the consequences actually matter. So you've probably heard of the famous Skinner box experiments where an animal, here it's a rat. Actually, Skinner, turns out, didn't use rats that much himself, and he didn't use punishment that much. But the basic notion is you've got an animal here, and it does something like pushes this lever, and based on it pushing the lever, some food will pop out, let's say. The animal ultimately would learn, if I push the lever, then I get the food. And it's not just that something happens and the food appears and those are associated. The idea is when I consciously do something, that then produces something in response, and the animal comes to appreciate that food, or in the other case, a shock from the grid, the punishment, is a consequence of that action. And that becomes the association. That's the learning. That's what's called the operant conditioning. And that was the fundamental insight of behaviorism, which was shown in many different experiments with animals and extended in some ways to humans. Very powerful, very influential, especially in the mid to late 20th century. But over time, behaviorism started to lose sway for reasons that we'll talk about. But those fundamental experiments aren't necessarily wrong, and there is something to the notion that, at least in certain cases, people will respond to stimuli and people will learn to make associations between those two things. So if you get a reward, if you know that by raising your hand every day in class, you're going to get called on and you're going to get a good check mark on your book, and that's going to give you a good grade in the class, you learn to make those associations. And it is real to think that that kind of system, as long as the rewards are always there when the person does the action, that kind of system will, in fact, at least in some circumstances, lead people to raise their hand more. But we'll talk about what some of the limitations of that are. Behaviorism, though, as I said, is not just something that was important for Skinner and animal researchers. It's still with us today. And it's most notably with us today, at least at the cutting edge, in behavioral economics. Behavioral economics is thought of as a very new and novel and influential branch of economics, but it's behavioral. That's why it's called behavioral economics, and the point is it has that same approach of thinking about what people actually do as opposed to trying to ask the question of why. So behavioral economics associated with people like the Nobel laureates Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, or Dan Ariely, or Richard Thaler. Behavioral economics says, let's look at what people actually do. Let's not look at abstract economic theory, which says people will always respond perfectly to incentives. So you've probably heard the old joke about, or maybe you haven't, the old joke about that an economist is walking down the street and sees a $20 bill laying on the street and keeps on walking by because the economist says, well, no, that can't possibly be a $20 bill there. Because, here's my great diagram of a $20 bill. Not sure if that helps you much, but makes something interesting happen. If that were actually a $20 bill lying on the street, someone would have picked it up. We know that people are incentivized to pick up a $20 bill, so it can't possibly be there because economic theory tells me it must have already been picked up. Ha ha. Okay, well the point there is, in reality, people don't always conform to abstract economic theory. So behavioral economics says, let's look at what people actually do. And we see, for example, that people are more afraid of losing, let's say, $100 than they are of the possibility of gaining $100. Economic theory says you should be indifferent. A 50% chance of winning $100 should be exactly the same to you as a 50% chance of losing $100. Not true. People are much more willing to take a flyer on the gain than they are on the loss, even with the same probabilities. Defaults are important. In economic theory, it shouldn't matter, for example, whether something is opt-in or opt-out. So if the company you work for says, check this box to put money every year into your 401k, it should lead to exactly the same result as if the company says, this money will get put into your 401k unless you check this box to say, no, don't do that. Turns out, we know empirically, that much more money goes into the 401k if it's the opt-out, if by default the money goes in. Even though it doesn't require anything that hard to just check a box, people tend to go with defaults. Confirmation bias. People tend to see what they are looking for. If you think that you're going to get a certain result, then you tend to find it. because our brains tend to want to see patterns whether or not they're really there. And again, economic theory in the abstract says that shouldn't be the case. Behavioral economics modifies it and says empirically we know people behave in certain ways. Okay, here are some takeaways on behaviorism, all of which are very relevant for gamification. The first is observation. We should look at what people actually do. If the $20 bill is still there, pick it up. If people respond in a certain way to a stimulus, then we should learn something from that, as opposed to just focusing in on our theories about what's going on. The second is the importance of feedback loops. When the person involved sees some feedback on their behavior, which they can then observe, it tends to produce a response. And that process, that circular process of action and feedback and response, tends to motivate behavior, and that's a powerful process to understand for gamification. And finally, the notion in behaviorism of reinforcement, that learning occurs by the reinforcement of stimuli. When more and more you see that a certain action produces a certain result, you tend to learn and make that association. You actually make a neural connection in your brain between those two things. That's an important lesson from behaviorism that's going to be relevant in thinking of how to motivate and encourage certain activities through gamified systems.